Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and once again it's time for the Q&A, so let's go ahead and get this started. Alright, first question. Hi Jason, is depleting muscle glycogen useful at all when trying to lose fat? Thanks for all your great content. No, this is the sort of nonsense that people use to come up with these ideas of why fasted training would burn more body fat, or fasted cardio, or why low-carb diets help with this. And the reality is, going out of your way to intentionally deplete muscle glycogen is actually counterproductive for fat loss, because it's calorie deficit that creates fat loss, right? Now, granted, there are nutrient partitioning things that can happen with noobs who are noob games or morbidly obese people that can cause recomposition. Drugs can cause recomposition. Certain dietary practices can do this, but for the most part, fat loss is generally going to be a product of caloric deficit, right? And having reduced muscle glycogen is going to happen when you're in a calorie deficit anyways, right? It's unavoidable. It's absolutely unavoidable when your calories are reduced and you're burning more calories than you're taking in. You can't avoid this. However, going out of your way to do so reduces muscle retention. And it certainly reduces muscle gain, because you create a less anabolic environment and you create a more catabolic environment for your muscle tissue. So you're more likely to lose muscle when you do this. And if you're at the same calorie deficit, but you're losing muscle faster, or if you're trying to recomposition and you're gaining muscle slower, you are going to lose less body fat. Because again, body fat loss is a result of caloric deficit. And if some of that calorie deficit is coming from your muscle tissue, that's not desirable. That's not helpful. So no, absolutely not. If anything, you should try to have your muscle glycogen be as full as possible when you train. It should be as full as possible when you train, and realize that it's calorie deficit that determines fat loss as a primary factor involved. And there's just not much you can do to get around that unless you're willing to do very, very slow recomposition, which is fine. That's a viable tactic. That's what I'm doing right now. I did a 30-pound cut, and now I'm doing a recomp. But people need to understand that recomposition is slow. It is slow. And so no, back to the other point, reducing your muscle glycogen stores intentionally isn't going to improve fat loss in any meaningful way. It's only going to cause muscle loss, and it's an unavoidable situation to some extent anyways, right? If you just want your muscle glycogen slightly reduced, you don't need to do anything special to do that. Your calorie deficit alone is going to cause that. But it certainly doesn't mean you should be reducing carbohydrates below an optimal level to fuel your training. It doesn't mean you should be trying to do your lifting or anything fasted or with fewer carbs in your system. It's just not a good idea. And even fasted cardio, the studies that we have on it show that in some cases you burn less fat doing fasted cardio, because your overall energy turnover tends to be lower. So there's just a lot of factors to look at there. All right, next question. In your recent video on deloading, I assume you should deload for about 1 week or maybe longer on how the sides feel as long as you have subsided. I know you said the point of a deload was to come back stronger. My question is, when you got back to your progression, should you start where you left off, a slight bit less, or even more since you have deloaded things? Well, this is only something that you need to concern yourself with, the latter part, if you're actually writing your own programs, right? If you're not qualified to write your own programs, you probably shouldn't be writing your own programs. Normally, deloads, when you follow a written program, either weight resets or, more importantly, full deloads, are part of the structured program. You're told by the coach already what you're supposed to do when you get back from the deload. It's just part of the program. So let the coach do the thinking. As far as your own personal training, that's going to depend on what you're doing. Are you doing some sort of concurrent training? Are you doing linear progression? Are you doing block periodization? Because if you're doing concurrent training, you're probably going to pick back up where you left off. If you're doing linear training, you're going to pick back up where you left off, right? Or at least a drop below, like right where you may be stalled, right, but slightly below it. Or in some cases, if you're running some concurrent style training, you might come right back and try to hit a PR. That's probably what I'm going to do. my next heavy squat day after my deload, I'm going to go ahead and see if I can take a weight that I went to do a triple on a week before the deload and only got a double and it just felt too heavy to try for 3. And I'm going to see if I can get my 3. But if you're doing some sort of linear periodization or block periodization, you're probably going to go into a completely different block in your training. So you're going to change it up quite a bit. Now back to the other question. No, you shouldn't need to deload longer than a week. If you need to deload longer than a full week, you did something very, very wrong in your training, and you probably need to stop writing your own programs. You need to let someone else do it for you. You don't know what you're doing. If you need more than that. So I'm going to say you need to go ahead and hand control over to someone else at that point. All right, next question. Hey Jason, what is your take on hard labor jobs like construction building muscle? I know it's hard to track progressive overload with it, but do you think it builds a lot of muscle? Thanks, man. Big fan of yours. I think construction type work, depending upon how hard the labor is, can build some muscle. Is it going to build the amount of muscle that you're going to build on a structured training program in a year? No, it's not. It's absolutely not. But it will build a fair amount of functional strength. And the other thing is, usually construction work, because it tends to use a lot of gripping and pulling and lifting and forearm stuff without straps, guys who do construction work tend to have really strong forearms and grip strength and forearm development that usually outpaces a lot of lifters who don't train correctly. In other words, a lot of bodybuilders and other people get shocked when they shake hands or have to arm wrestle someone who does manual labor, because most of those guys focus too much on isolation and straps and everything else, and they end up having really weak grips sometimes, not always, but oftentimes, and a lot of gym bros because of that. And then they find someone who actually does a lot of work for their forearms and grip every day, day in, day out at a job, and they find out that their grip is really weak. So in my experience, manual labor, it varies, except for a few genetic freaks. I've met a few guys who look like bodybuilders purely from doing manual labor, but they're also very, very genetically gifted. But can it build muscle? Can it help you build a little bit of a base before you go into training? Yeah, absolutely. Depending upon the nature of the work, and that's what it comes down to. How much progressive overload did you get? Are you just swinging a light hammer all day? Are you carrying sheetrock all day? Or are you, driving T-posts out on a ranch and stacking 100-pound bales of hay hundreds of times a day, 2 or 3 days a week, or at least on the weekend? It's going to be a lot of questions involved. In other words, how much actual workload is there? How much actual workload is there? And that's going to be the determining factor of how much muscle you gain. All right, next question. Hey Jason, I know you're not big on doing much fluff and pump. However, I've been trying out tricep kickbacks with a dumbbell, and I feel my triceps, especially the long head, more than I ever have before. What do you think of this movement? Is it worth doing, or are there better alternatives? Thanks, coach. I'm not sure if you're trolling or not, actually, bro. And the reason I say that is because I don't consider the tricep kickback to be a useful exercise at all. And I'm saying that coming from a sport that values tricep development. That being said, why would a tricep kickback be good for the long head? Biomechanically speaking, why would it do that? It's not even a good long head exercise. The tricep kickbacks works the long head less than the overhead press does, and certainly less than any isolation movements that focuses on it. So you're asking that, and you're saying you feel it in the long head. Well, let me ask you a question. Do you honestly think, and I want you to think on this for a moment, do you honestly think that where you feel an exercise is actually always correlated with what it works? People will say, what? Of course it does. Really? Because that's not how things work in the real world. In other words, isolation movements can sometimes make you feel a muscle more without working it more, in some cases working it less. And it has to do with priority of what you feel. You need to understand all of your pain, cramping, discomfort, heat, cold, everything else in your body is sensors in your body detecting stuff. And when certain sensors don't pick up everything, and you can focus on one thing, you'll feel that more than another. And a case in point, if you're feeling a certain amount of pain already in your quad or whatever, you've been poked with a needle in your quad, and I run up and jab you real quick in the calf with a needle, you're probably going to feel the calf and forget about the quad. You're going to not even feel the quad anymore. And that's one of the things that happens with a lot of big isolation or big compound movements, is that you work several different muscles very heavily. And even though you have a muscle that might have been activated maximally because so many other basically sensors were going off at the same time, you didn't notice it so much. But then you go do a different exercise in which you feel it there more. And it doesn't necessarily mean because of contraction. It could be just purely due to a stretch in the connective tissue that doesn't necessarily involve more muscle fiber recruitment. Something to keep in mind there. Because you can stretch a muscle and feel it more than sometimes when you're actually doing work with it. So what can oftentimes happen is that you get a disproportionate feeling somewhere that literally has nothing to do with muscle activation. So no, that's not the best way to determine this at all. And I mean, this is a textbook example. You just described that with a tricep kickback, but a tricep kickback is not even a particularly good long head tricep exercise, just from a biomechanics perspective. Alright guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time in part 2.